Well, do you like our new comedian on staff, Anthony, right? I have to verify a few things. He says they won that last dodgeball game. I had to let them win because I didn't want to knock his self-confidence down too early on. And so, no, we had a great week at Orange Beach, didn't we, students, right? It was incredible, and God worked and moved in some amazing ways, and it's not done yet. In fact, after the service is over, we're going to see several of these students get baptized today, and so we're going to celebrate that. Well, welcome to Compass, our mission's navigating people to God. My name is Nate, and I'm the campus pastor here, and we're so glad that you're here, so glad you're worshiping with us. If you're a guest, if this is your first time, we'd love to meet you, and I would definitely love to connect with you. We have a gift that we'd like to give you. It's our way of saying we're glad that you're here. Now, here's the thing. We've been in this series called Me and My Big Mouth, and the reality is we all have those moments in life where we say things that we wish we could take back, don't we? Like, have you ever had one of those moments where you just wish that you would have stuck your foot in your mouth before you said something? Even as this series was going on, there were certain times where I had to check myself because I'm preaching on this and then I'm not following suit on what I said, right? Yeah, my son is shaking his head in the front row because I said something to him yesterday and I went, be quick to listen, slow to speak, right? And that's what James is kind of the guy who wrote the book of James. His name is James. He's the half-brother of Jesus. And James tells us this in James chapter 1:19. It says, be quick to listen and slow to speak. And so we kind of kicked off that series looking at that and kind of setting up the ground, laying the groundwork for this. And then last week we moved to another guy's words in Ephesians chapter 4, this guy by the name of Paul. And Paul said it's not just that you need to be quick to listen and slow to speak, but you also need to make sure that the words that you speak are words that build other people up and not tear other people down. And if you were here last week, I encourage you, I challenge you to memorize Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29. So when you had one of those moments where somebody maybe said something to you that was hurtful, you didn't lash back out and say something hurtful as well. And those words were, what Paul said was, don't let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouth, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. And we talked about how as followers of Christ, our talk should be different and the way that we talk should be different to others, and that the words that come from our mouth should not be distasteful, that they shouldn't be unwholesome, that they shouldn't, we said the word unwholesome is the smell of rotting fish, right? That it shouldn't be this nasty thing that is coming from our mouth. And because of that, if that's how we speak, if we speak wholesome things, that people will be better off from it. Now, Paul said that for some of us, the reason we have a hard time with this, the reason that we have a hard time saying nice things to other people is because of words that have been spoken to us or words that have been spoken about us or even words that have been spoken over us. And because of that, those words have haunted us ever since and we've become bitter. And if we want to get this right, we said that what we have to do is we've got to get rid of the bitterness in our lives because you cannot be a builder if you're bitter. And the only way this happens if we're truly willing to forgive. And we said forgiveness is saying, I'm gonna give someone from the past what they don't deserve so I can give someone around me now what they do deserve. And you see, if we'll do this, if this is how we respond, the good news is we get to be the hero in our own story. But it goes beyond just forgiving our past and loving the people around us. We have the potential to be the hero in our own story because of something that I want to share with you today through the story of one guy. Now, here's what I mean, and here's what we have to understand. This is kind of sets the tone for where we're headed today. And what we have to understand is that sometimes what goes around comes around. And sometimes you will find yourself in a position where you are powerless, where you have no control over the situation, but then there might come a moment where you become the one in power and you have the power over the person who hurt you in the past. And the words that you say, the words that you speak, and how you respond matters. There's actually a story that we find contained in the pages of Scripture that helps us to understand that. It's a story that has all kinds of twists and turns along the way, but I think it's a story that can really help us as we follow this advice to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and when we do speak, make sure that the words that come from our mouths are words that build others up and not tear them down. This story actually takes place all the way back at the very beginning of the Bible in Genesis, in the book of Genesis. So if you have a Bible or a Bible app on your smartphone, you can turn with me there. And I'll just let you know, we're gonna do like a Cliff Notes version of this guy's story because it takes up 15 chapters in the book of Genesis. Now, if I just went verse by verse through those 15 chapters, you would be here for the next 3 weeks probably. So you're gonna thank me by the end of it that it's only gonna be 30 minutes. But here we hear this story that I think is really powerful and is really helpful. But to understand this guy's story, we actually have to go back a little bit and we have to start out a few generations before with his great-grandfather. And this guy's great-grandfather's name is Abraham. Abraham has this day where God comes to him and God promises Abraham that his family is going to become this great nation. Now, what's interesting about that promise is that Abraham and his wife Sarah are 90 years of age at the time that God makes this promise to Abraham. And Abraham and his Sarah have not been able to have any kids. So Abraham's got to be thinking like, all right, God, like seriously, this is not really going to happen. Well, at the age of 199, guess what happens? Abraham and Sarah have their one and only child, a son by the name of Isaac. Isaac will later get married. He will have two sons, Jacob and Esau, which really these sons are kind of at each other all the time, and it's not it doesn't look like the makings of a great family, much less a great nation. But all of that's about to change because things pick up pretty quickly. The next thing that happens is Jacob gets married. Well, actually, he gets married multiple times. He ends up having 12 sons, which a few generations later will become this small nation that we now know today as Israel. But here's what's interesting about the promise that God made to Abraham. The promise that God made to Abraham that his family would be this great nation was all going to hinge on the words of this one guy that we're going to look at today. This one guy's words, the statement that will come from his mouth, could literally have changed the course of eternity for you and I. But what we'll see is that this guy that we're going to look at today, he will use his words in a way that will push God's plan forward. And the guy that we want to look at today is a guy by the name of Joseph. Now, if you're into musicals, you've probably heard of Joseph before. He had this Technicolor dream coat, and he was the favorite son of his father, this guy Jacob. And the reason that he's the favorite son of Jacob is because he's the son of Jacob's favorite wife. That's right, Jacob has two wives. He has multiple other mistresses, and so his 12 sons come from a variety of different women. And there's a powerful lesson that we learn here right away, guys. The first lesson that I want to tell you today is this: don't have a favorite wife, okay? Right? The second lesson that I will tell you is don't have more than one wife, because that's just a disaster waiting to happen. I mean, if you watch TLC and the Sister Wives, that dude, he's crazy, right? And what we find out about Joseph is that he is the favorite son, and because he's the favorite son, Joseph awards him with this Technicolor dream coat. I like to think of it looking a lot like the starter jacket I used to have when I was in middle school, right? And so Joseph is rocking his starter jacket, and the brothers are all upset because they didn't get one. And so the brothers decided that they're going to get rid of their brother. They got to get rid of the problem, they think. And so they think it's a really good idea. They're like, hey, let's go ahead and kill him, right? That makes sense. Right? And so they grab Joseph one day, they bind him up, and they throw him into this pit. And that's where we're going to pick up in the story. If you have your Bible, you can look with me in Genesis chapter 37, starting in verse 25. They bound him up, and this is what happens next. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Now, before I go any further, I threw that in there because I think this is a funny part of the story. Here these guys are, they've just bound their brother up, they've thrown him into a pit, they're getting ready to kill him, and then one of the brothers is like, hey guys, that was a lot of work wrapping Joseph up. I'm kind of hungry. Anybody else hungry? Did anybody pack the Lunchables and the bologna sandwiches the mom left on the counter today? Somebody passed the Doritos and the Red Bull energy drinks, right? And so they sit down and they're eating lunch first, and then they see this caravan come by. And as we continue reading here in Genesis 37, it says this. It says, their camels were loaded with spices and balm and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. And Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. He and his brothers agreed. So Joseph, because of an act of compassion, the brothers decide we're not gonna kill our brother. We'll just go ahead and sell him into slavery. And so he gets sold into slavery and he's headed to Egypt. The brothers think that they've gotten rid of their problem. Joseph's not sure if he's ever gonna see his family again, and he's not even really sure what life has in store for him. And so we pick back up in the story. We move to Genesis chapter 39, verses 1 and 2. It says this, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. And then catch this next sentence. It says, the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. Now I know some of you might be thinking, if the Lord was with Joseph, then why would he have allowed Joseph to be sold into slavery by his brothers? But you see, what we will see throughout Joseph's story is there will come these roadblocks and these hurdles along the way that will make you maybe even question what God was doing. And maybe you even have some of those moments in your own life where there are those hurdles or those roadblocks that come where you wonder what God's up to or what his plan is. And we see this theme mentioned over and over again throughout Joseph's story, that the Lord was with Joseph despite whatever it was that he went through. But not only was God with Joseph, we see that Joseph remains faithful to God despite everything that he goes through, despite every curveball that gets thrown his way. He continued to keep his focus on God. And as we see that Joseph, ultimately, as the story continues, we see him find favor with his new master, Potiphar. And Potiphar puts Joseph in charge of the entire household. He's really taken a liking to Joseph. But Potiphar is not the only one that's taken a liking to Joseph. Potiphar's wife does as well. She has a starring role in the original housewives of Egypt. That's who she is, right? And so one day, Joseph, he walks into the house, and Potiphar's wife's got a little Barry White playing in the background, right? And then he walks into the room, and Potiphar's wife quotes a little bit of Blake Shelton, and she says, we don't have to be lonely tonight. I need you, want you right by my side, right? But Joseph resists the temptation in that moment. He's like, no, I can't do this. And actually, it's probably the first time in Potiphar's wife's whole life that she's ever been told no. The reason why that Joseph tells her no is twofold. Look at what it says here in verse 9. It says, no one is greater than I am, and my master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. And then he says this, he says, how could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Now, we read this and we might think, okay, here's Joseph again. You're trusting this God who's allowed you to be put into slavery, and now you're living in captivity. That's the God you're going to put your trust in the midst of all that you're facing. And again, it's only about to get worse for Joseph, because even though Joseph told Potiphar's wife no, she doesn't like that answer. And so she tries to make another advance. And Joseph again, this time he's like, man, I got to get out of here. And so he starts to run away, but Potiphar's wife grabs a hold of his cloak and pulls it off of him. So now he's streaking through the house and through the town, and she's got his cloak in her hands. And now she's got to come up with a story, because Potiphar's going to wonder why Joseph's cloak's there and Joseph's running around the house naked, right? And so she comes up with this story that Joseph tried to rape her. Well, Potiphar is infuriated by that, and so he sends Joseph to prison. But notice again what happens to Joseph in prison. In verses 20 and 21 of chapter 39, it says this, but while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness, and he granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. And look, I get it. Like, again, you might be thinking, how is God showing favor to Joseph? by allowing him to go to prison. Because he's not the one who did anything wrong. In fact, in this moment, he makes a really good choice. He runs from the temptation. And it should have been Potiphar's wife that should have to be answering for what she was trying to do, but Joseph's the one that ends up in prison. And really, as I'm reading this, I'm thinking to myself, okay, who really wants favor in the eyes of the warden? Now think about that for a minute. If you have favor in the eyes of the warden, that means that you've spent a lot of time in prison and you're probably not going anywhere anytime soon. So how is God with Joseph? Maybe you're thinking. I think it begs the question that a lot of us struggle with even when it comes to God, and maybe you've brought that into this place today. And that is this: how could God, if he's so good, how could he allow bad things to happen to a good guy like Joseph who was doing the right things? And the reality is this: bad things have been happening to good people for a long time. But even in the bad times, God is always with good people. For Joseph, despite the situation that he found himself in, God was there in the prison cell with him. And as we continue in the story, we find that Joseph again finds himself moving into this position of power in the prison. And while Joseph is in prison, he ends up getting partnered up with some cellmates who are a couple of outed officials from Pharaoh's court, his butler, kind of his wine taster, and the baker. And these guys become inmates together, and they become really good friends, and they spend years in prison together. And one day, the text tells us that they're sitting in the cell together, and Joseph kind of recognizes that the two other guys are really down on this day. Now, again, I think it's funny because any day that you spend in a prison cell is probably a down day, right? But on this day, there was something noticeably different. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was that when he looked at them, they had the Michael Jordan ugly cry face going on or something like that. I don't know what it was. But on this day, Joseph notices and he says, hey, what's going on, guys? And so these two guys, they both say, well, we had these dreams and we don't understand what the dreams mean. And Joseph's like, well, maybe if you tell me the dreams, I can cry out to God and see if God can help give an answer to what your dreams mean. And so Joseph, these guys agree to it. And so the butler goes first and he tells Joseph the dream. And Joseph gets a word from God and he tells the butler, he's like, I've got good news for you. In 3 days, it's going to be Pharaoh's birthday and you're going to be restored to your position of power in the kingdom. You're going to go back to being the butler and the wine taster for Pharaoh. And so now that you know that, okay, don't forget me when you get out of here, or tell Pharaoh what I have done for you. Well, the baker's thinking, man, if that's what the butler gets, I can't wait to find out what's going to happen to me. And so he tells Joseph his dream as well. Well, Joseph says, I've got news for you as well. Your head's going to be lifted up, but not in the way that you want. In fact, in 3 days, you're going to die. You're going to be killed. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, bro. And so you know what happens next, right? 3 days later, the butler gets restored to his position. The baker gets killed. Joseph, he gets another roadblock. He gets forgotten. The butler fails to tell anybody what his friend had just done for him in the prison cell. And maybe for some of you here today, maybe for some of you, you feel a lot like Joseph. Like you have that moment in your life, or maybe you're at that point in your life right now where you feel forgotten. Maybe you're here today and you feel like no one loves you, or no one cares about you, or no one has any concern for you. Now, my guess is you can relate to a guy like Joseph, because years are going to pass and nothing happens for Joseph. He just continues to sit in that prison cell. But the thing about Joseph is, even despite that, he continued to live for God. And one day, all that waiting patiently is about to pay off, because Pharaoh ends up having this series of dreams. He doesn't understand what they mean. They're kind of terrifying to him. And so he's trying to figure out what they mean. So he brings all of his advisors in. He brings magicians in. He brings in anybody who thought could interpret the dreams for him. Nobody can interpret these dreams. And that's when the butler remembers his friend who's sitting in that prison cell. And so he goes over to Pharaoh and he tells him, hey, I know a guy who might be able to help you out. His name's Joseph. He's in prison, but he told me what my dream meant, and it was 100% accurate. And Pharaoh hears this, and look at what it says here in chapter 41, verses 14 and 15. It says, so Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. And when he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And listen to Joseph's response here, because I think this is probably one of the most courageous statements that someone can make who's in the shoes of a guy like Joseph. What Joseph says to Pharaoh in response to Pharaoh's request is this: I cannot do it. And the butler's got to be like, dude, what are you doing, man? Like, seriously? I just tried to help you out, and now you're going to get yourself thrown into the hole. You're never going to see daylight any time of the day, and I'm probably going back to prison. Because I told Pharaoh that you could help him out, and now you're telling him you can't do it? But Joseph wasn't done. He goes on to say this. He says, I can't do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer that he desires. Now here's why this is interesting. You see, Pharaoh saw himself as a god. But Joseph's like, my God, the big G God, is the only one who can interpret this dream for you. And that statement alone should have got Joseph thrown right back into his prison cell. But Pharaoh is so desperate for an answer to what his dreams meant that he's like, okay, I'll take it. Whatever it is, just help me out. If your God can interpret the dream. So Pharaoh tells Joseph the dreams, and Joseph gets a word from God, and the gist of the dreams is basically this: that Egypt is going to go through this period where they're going to have more than enough food for 7 years. And then they're going to have a period where they're not going to have enough food. And so they're going to go through this famine. And as Joseph is interpreting this dream, he begins to give Pharaoh advice on how to make sure this is all going to happen. And he says, you're going to need somebody who can orchestrate this, somebody who's honest, who's faithful, who checks and balances everything. And as he's doing this, Pharaoh's like, ding, 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 winner, winner, chicken dinner. You're the guy for the job, Joseph. I want to offer the second most position of power in all of Egypt to you. Do you want the job? And my guess is that everybody else in the room goes silent, because there were people who were waiting to be put to that position of power. And they're like, are you kidding me? The guy who's in prison has just risen to second in command over all of Egypt? Seriously? But nobody was going to question Pharaoh. And so Joseph, after being given this opportunity, he's like, oh, all right, I had to do that for the students, right? I'll do it, right? And he now becomes second in command over all of Egypt. Well, Joseph gets to work preparing for the famine. He stores up grain during the 7 good years, and then the famine hits. And the famine doesn't just hit Egypt. It gets so bad that it begins to spread outside the borders into these other lands. And one of those areas is where Joseph's family resided. Remember those brothers who had got him into this mess in the first place? Well, Jacob, he hears about the grain that's available back in Egypt, so he tells 10 of Joseph's brothers that they need to pack their stuff, and they need to go, and they need to buy some grain so that their family won't starve to death. And that's when the stage gets set. The tides are about to turn. Because remember, Joseph had been put in charge of everything in the kingdom of Egypt. He's the one who's selling the grain to the people. And on that day when Joseph's brothers arrive in town to buy some grain, guess who it is that's right there that's selling it to him? It's Joseph. Now, the brothers, they bow down. They don't recognize him. Maybe it's because he was now walking like an Egyptian or something like that. I don't know what it was, right? Okay, that's the corny dad joke. But Joseph, he recognizes his brothers. And in that moment, he knows that they don't know who he is. And think about this for a minute. I mean, here are the brothers who had put him in this position. They had sold him into slavery, and now they're bowing before him, and he's the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. He could literally do whatever he wanted. He could have had them arrested right then and there. But there's something in his response that we can learn. Because it may not be now that you wrestle with a situation like maybe what Joseph was going through. But my guess is at some point in time in your life, there will come this time where someone will say something to you, or someone will hurt you because of their actions, and you will have a chance to respond. And I think we need to be prepared. So I want to give you a question to really think about and wrestle with. And that question is this: what do you do when you've got the power and your words determine the destiny of your enemy? Because here's the thing: what goes around comes around. And you know the answer to that question. It hinges on what we talked about last week and what you do with your bitterness and your anger. Because if you have pent up bitterness and anger and rage in your life and you're carrying that baggage around, you will bring it forward into the future. And you will use it in a negative way. And as Joseph's brothers are bowing to him, I wonder if he was thinking about all that had happened to him. I wonder if he thought about that day that he got bound up and thrown into the pit and then sold into slavery. I wonder if he thought about how he was betrayed by Potiphar's wife and ultimately ended up spending years in prison, in a prison cell, for something that he did not do. Now, I wonder if he thought about all the pain and the hurt that he'd experienced because of the choices of others, or even what he could do to get revenge on his brothers. Now, for the sake of time today, we got to skip ahead, but there's 3 chapters where Joseph kind of has a little bit of fun with his brothers. He accuses them of being spies. He sets them up one time and he puts a valuable item in one of their bags. It was really just his way of getting his other brother who didn't come along on the journey to come back so he could see him, and also so he could see his father. And he was using these several months really just to test his brothers to see if they were actually different or if they had just kind of stayed the same. And if you and I are in Joseph's shoes, my guess is we might have handled things differently than Joseph did. But my guess is that Joseph had asked himself this question that I just gave you: what do you do when you've got the power and your words determine the destiny of your enemy? You see, there comes a moment for Joseph where he can't keep the secret of who he is any longer to his brothers quiet. And so they come back now. All the brothers are there. They're gathered in this room. And as they're in the room together, he tells all the guards and the attendants to leave. And then he has a little bit more fun with them. He goes, hey, I heard this story that you guys might have had another brother who actually got sold into slavery in Egypt. And the brothers, they're like, we did, yeah, and it was kind of a weird thing, and they probably tried to him-haul around, and they're like, how did you know that? And that's when he's like, because it's me, little Joe, guys, guess what, right? And they're probably all like, jaws dropping to the ground, and he's like, man, you should see the look on your faces right now, right? And then the text says that they all wet themselves, and they had a little accident in their pants. Okay, that's not actually in there. But you got to imagine that's going through their minds in this moment, right? Now, my guess is they expected payback to be just as bad as what they had done to him. In their minds, they were done for. But Joseph instead just does this. He asked them a question. In Genesis 45, verse 3, the second half, it says this. He says, look, I'm Joseph. And then he says, is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Now, notice what the author says here. His brothers were terrified at his presence. But what we're about to see is they didn't need to be terrified because Joseph had lived as though God was with him, even in the midst of all the struggles and all the difficulties and all the hardships that he faced in his life. And as the story continues to go, Joseph and his brothers and their father, they all get reunited together, and they live happily ever after until Joseph's father, Jacob, dies. And then the brothers, they think that Joseph's going to take them out. And so we skip ahead to Genesis chapter 50, and the brothers, we see them come back to Joseph another day, and they're on their hands and their knees, and they're begging Joseph for mercy because they think that now that their father's dead, that Joseph's going to kill them. But notice what Joseph says in Genesis chapter 50, verses 19 and 20. It says, don't be afraid of me. Am I a God that I can punish you? You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so that I could save the lives of many people. You see, what Joseph could not have known was that God's plan for eternity, it dangled on the thread of his one sentence that he would say to his brothers. Because before him sat 10 of the 12 brothers who would make up the 12 tribes of Israel, through whom God would introduce the Savior of the world, this guy by the name of Jesus. And Jesus was going to do for you and I what Joseph did for his brothers. He was going to forgive us of everything that we've ever done. You see, Joseph could have easily gotten even. He could have chosen to be bitter and get back, but instead he chose love and forgiveness to his brothers. And like Joseph, you have to recognize that you will never experience the good that comes from the bad unless you recognize that God was with you during the good time, during the bad, and you refuse to play God when things are good. You will never experience the good that comes from the bad unless you recognize that God was with you during the bad and you refuse to play God when things are good. I want to encourage you to be like Joseph. Rather than throw out anger towards somebody who has hurt you through your words, through your actions, throw out love and forgiveness to those who need it. Because your words are powerful. I don't know if you saw this week or not. There's a video that went viral and it's all over social media, and I saw it on SportsCenter too. And when I saw it, I was like, I gotta put that into my message somewhere. And it's just a powerful reminder of how powerful your words can be. Take a look at this.
Do it now. Jump up on that box now. Go. On the box. Do it again. Forward. Run. All the people that told you you can't. Right here. Jump on it now. Run.
I have to tell you that every time I watch that, I get a little bit emotional. Just seeing this kid without arms do something that he thought was maybe impossible. I did a little bit more research on the story and found out the kid goes by Young Tim, and he's in this training program that's called Nub Ability, and they help those that are missing limbs and extremities to push through and to do things that they might not be able to do. And as you saw in that video, he's trying to do a 20-inch box jump. Now, that might not seem like that big a deal for you and I with arms, because we can get a little bit of momentum, but when you don't have those, it's pretty hard. And as you saw, there's multiple failed attempts, and then he finally gets up on top of that. And then he goes and he hugs his trainer, and it was those words that she was speaking to him that kept him pushing forward and trying to do his best to get to the top of that box. You see, you can determine someone's destiny by the words that you choose to say. And so as we close out this series today, I want to just say this. Make sure that the words that you choose those words wisely. As we close out, let me ask you this question. Who is it that needs some encouraging words that you know in your life right now? Is it a son or a daughter? Is it your spouse? Is it a coworker? Maybe students, you need to say some encouraging words to your parents. Maybe it's someone at school that sits by themselves that just needs to be built up rather than feeling all alone. I don't know who it is, but who is it that you need to say some encouraging words to this week? This past Christmas, I was, we always buy gifts for each other. Our family does, and a lot of the gifts they're nice gifts, and we use them for a while, and then they fade away. The batteries don't work anymore, or they're just not useful, or they break, or something happens to them. And so this year I was like, man, I want to do something different. I want to get my kids, and I want to get my wife Amanda something different that they'll be able to keep, that will stand the test of time. And so I thought about it. I racked my brain for a long time, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And then I kind of got this idea. It was based off of something a friend of mine does every year for his family. He would write this letter that kind of was a recap of the year. And so I just decided to take a one step further. I love the idea of that. And so a week before Christmas, I went to the store and I found these different journals that I thought had different meaning for my daughter McKenna and our son Blake and my wife Amanda. And I picked up those journals and then took them home, and inside of the front cover of each one, I wrote them a note, a letter, just giving them the encouragement they need. And on those days when they're down, when they're not sure, they're not certain about where life may be headed, that they could look at those words and know that I love them and I care about them, and that I know that God has big plans for their lives. And maybe you need to do that for someone else. Maybe you need to take some time this week and just simply write a note. I know last week I said sometimes we need to keep our words at bay, but I think there are some times where we need to share those words with someone else because they need to hear it in their lives. Who's that person in your life that needs some encouraging words spoken over them? You know, as we close out this series, we've been talking about our words and how powerful our words can be. And I think the most powerful words that could ever be spoken are words about your destiny and your eternity. And I think there are some of you who maybe need to speak some of the most powerful words you can ever speak in your life, and you need to do that today. And you need to just say these words: I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Several of our students did that this week at camp, and that's why they're getting baptized. And maybe you need to join them. And so it's kind of a spontaneous decision day. We were like, hey, do you want to make that decision? We'll get the tank here. But that means that we were prepared for anybody else who might want to make that decision as well. And so maybe you came here today and you didn't think that you were going to make that decision, but you're ready to do that. We want you to know we've got everything. We've got shorts, t-shirts, we've got undergarments, we've got towels, we've got it all. And we'd love for you to take that step of faith and to say those words that will change your life forever. And so we're going to sing a song here in just a minute. I want you to know your words are powerful. Your words can shape someone's future. They can determine your destiny. So choose your words wisely. As we stand and sing this song today, I know that there are some of you who maybe carry in some weight from some words that have been said to you. And those words weigh heavy on you right now in this place, and you need to simply give those over to God. And so as we sing this song today, I want to invite you, you can come to the front. And myself and Anthony and some of our team will be around. We would love to pray with you over those things. If you just need to give those over to God, we want to pray with you about that. Or maybe you're here today and you're saying, I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and I'm making him Lord and Savior of my life today. We want to invite you to come to the front as well. And we just want to celebrate that. And when someone comes to the front, we just want to clap. We want to celebrate that today, because we need to celebrate when people take those steps, when they're courageous, when they step out in faith. So would you just stand with us now as we sing this song? And if you need prayer, you have a decision to make, you can come at this time.